Will Canada's federal election be won on the international stage? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. Voters are a mere 2 months away from heading to the ballot box. When the Liberals came to power in 2015, Justin Trudeau pledged Canada is back and sunny ways as a counter to the 10 years of Stephen Harper. But the positive words and ambition were somewhat derailed by the 2016 U.S. election, which vaulted Donald Trump into the Oval Office. And since then, Canada's foreign policy has been turned upside down by his erratic behavior. It's a challenge, to say the least, to know when to zig when he zags. Justin Trudeau notes that the world needed more Canada, and he would bring it. Global media initially fawned over the new prime minister, but those eyes also saw mistakes and missteps over the last 4 years. It will be interesting to monitor Canadians' views on foreign policy when it comes to who to vote for. Is it an issue that's close to Canadians' hearts? Today on the Unpublished Cafe, we'll take a look at Canada's approach to foreign policy and whether it'll be a major influence in the upcoming election. We'll chat with Stephen Saidemen, the Paterson Chair in International Affairs, as well as the Director of the Canadian Defence and Security Network at Carleton University. We'll get his perspective on the party's approach to foreign affairs. First, I am pleased to be joined by Peggy Mason, President of the Rideau Institute, which has the aim to help revitalize Canada's peacekeeping, diplomatic peacemaking, and peace-building roles in the world. And Peggy, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
Canada is back was Justin Trudeau's call to the world. Is Canada back?
Well, I guess we're not as far back as was promised and many of us hoped. I think it's a fair commentary to say that there has been a gap, and of course you signaled a big reason why with the election of Donald Trump in the United States. We began to see almost immediately Canadian retrenchment, if you will. So the result has been a gap between our foreign policy rhetoric, which has largely continued with the Canada expressing strong support for the multilateral system and the rules-based international order, but the reality, being quite different from that. And I would add the point that it wasn't just with the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States, Canada reorganized its approach, its cabinet. Of course, that would make sense. And one of the results of that was Chrystia Freeland, then Minister of International Trade, made Canada's foreign minister, but given continuing responsibility as Minister of Canada, U.S. Trade. And if you were going to try and devise a setup that would sideline the rest of the multilateral agenda, that would be the way to do it, because it means your foreign minister is not really a foreign minister. Your foreign minister is a Canada-U.S. trade minister who perhaps in her spare time looks at the rest of the agenda. So the result has been that the promises of Canada really coming back and putting its money where its mouth is, has not. We haven't seen that to a large extent.
How would you compare Justin Trudeau's approach to foreign policy compared to his predecessor?
Well, you see, the interesting point that has to be made constantly is that the rhetoric actually matters, and that, in fact, even where we can point to a number of areas where we can say, well, the actual policy is regrettably not much different. The rhetoric is still different. And in a global situation where you've got the President of the United States attacking global institutions on a daily basis, attacking common rules, international law, threatening to take the international, to sanction the International Criminal Court, threatening to prosecute judges from the court to enter the U.S. When you've got that kind of global attack by the United States on the global rules of the road, the fact that you've got a government, a Canadian government, that at least rhetorically, and that's one thing that the foreign minister has continued to do, to constantly remind that we need international rules of the road, and we need to be working in support of them. That matters. So while so the biggest, perhaps, and there are happily some other areas of difference, but so the really when push comes to shove, the biggest single difference between the foreign policy of the Harper government and the present government, I mean, aside from the climate issue, which is massive and huge, but on other foreign policy issues, the biggest difference is Canada's rhetoric as opposed to what we're doing in reality. So that but if we look at the kind of substance of the issues, then we start to see that there isn't such a big difference. And let's take the question of Israel-Palestine. The government promised a more balanced approach, and it is true that they have reinstated funding, a very important funding for Palestinians. Through the main refugee agency that helps them, that had been ended by the Harper government, and the Trudeau government reinstated that, and they have strongly reiterated Canada's balanced policy. But if you look at our voting at the UN, the policy started, it really accelerated by the Harper government, of Canada being very isolated on votes involving Israel-Palestine. And in many cases, it's only Canada, the U.S., Israel, and, the Marshall Islands, largely, funded by the U.S., that are voting or voting with Israel on certain resolutions. So, that's an indicator where the rhetoric is better. Actually, the funding in support of Palestinians is better, but our stance at the UN, it has continued to be isolating us from a more balanced role. Now, if we look at rather than looking backwards at the Harper government, if we look at the sheer conservatism, what they're promising, of course, they're promising to go much further down the line of an unbalanced approach, and that is they're promising to follow the terrible steps taken by the Trump administration in recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, contrary to all of the international law and UN Security Council resolutions on the subject. And they have even promised that Canada would move its embassies to Jerusalem. So we have a situation where, okay, the policy is not as balanced as the Liberals promised at all. But on the other hand, it's not what the sheer Conservatives would do, which would be to completely take one side, of the equation.
Peggy Mason joining us on the Unpublished Cafe. She's president of the Rideau Institute as we talk about foreign affairs policy as we head towards the federal election coming up in October. And yeah, we've talked about our closest neighbor and biggest trading partner, the U.S., and obviously we've had some curveballs thrown at us since Donald Trump became president. On the international stage, how do you deal and negotiate with somebody who is as impulsive, almost petulant as he is?
Of course, that's the I wouldn't even say million, I'd say $1 trillion question. That's what all Canada's allies who care, and not just Canada's allies, all countries in the world who really do care about collective rules of the road, what they're all grappling with. And really, there are kind of two levels to that. There are things you can do to shore up the international system where the U.S. for the moment, doesn't seem to care. And I would take the example of UN peacekeeping, and that is one area where although the Liberal government did not go nearly as far as we would have liked with respect to re-engagement. I mean, one of their election promises was to fully re-engage in UN peacekeeping. They did re-engage, and they have had a number of initiatives, still, far below the numbers in terms of peacekeepers we would like to see, but nonetheless, they did take some significant steps. And so far as one can tell, Obama, under the Obama administration, they were very supportive of UN peacekeeping, and I don't think it was widely known that, in fact, they were very close to negotiating terms under which U.S. forces would actually participate under a UN leadership, which would have been, unprecedented it would have been from a very long time since the U.S. Has done that. But the Trump administration is, hostile to the UN, but they seem to have, they haven't really focused much attention on UN peacekeeping, except, of course, to severely curtail the budget. I mean, the Trump administration has wreaked havoc on the UN budget, and part of the damage was to UN peacekeeping. But nonetheless, they didn't seem to care much about Canada participating in it. That didn't seem to be a point of friction, and therefore, this would have been an area where we would have liked to have seen Canada do even more. So it was a good step. But it would have been, since it was an area where they could act without coming into, direct conflict with the Trump administration, we would have liked to have seen more. So that's the first thing. And again, if you had a foreign minister who was a full-time foreign minister, that would be the job of the foreign minister, looking very closely at the entire array of foreign policy areas where Canada has an interest and could work, and then trying to see where are the areas where we can really move forward without going into direct conflict with the United States. And then in other areas where that can't be avoided, looking much more closely at how can we work with other allies. And on that example, I would use, on that case, and I would use the example of Iran. I mean, most of our allies are working. I mean, the UK and Germany, and the UK until recently, although it's hard to say what Johnson's going to do, but Germany and led by the EU has been working extremely hard to try and keep together the Iran nuclear deal in the face of the United States, unilaterally violating that deal. And, they've tried all sorts of things. And Canada has rhetorically supported the deal and regretted the United States leaving it, but essentially has not done much else, except our foreign minister has, parroted American criticisms of Iran, and many of which, lack substance. So again, there's an area where Canada, again, if we had a foreign minister that was really focused on, okay, how can we maximize our ability to maneuver here without, totally putting ourselves in the line of fire with the United States, then that means work with other allies. And, we just haven't been doing that. There's a dual problem. It's not just that our foreign minister is mainly focused and looks at everything, it appears, from a trade perspective first, and so you've got no balancing with other things. She also seems to have extremely hawkish tendencies. I mean, I'm tempted to say she is a wolf in, and I'll have to spell it out, EWE's clothing to a great extent, and always seems to take a knee-jerk hardline approach to issues. So if we mention Iran, for example, these gratuitous attacks on Iran, when in fact our position is very much to try and keep the nuclear, to support the Iran nuclear deal. Or if we take, Canada's role with respect to Ukraine, I mean, essentially that role, the Harper role has of just not really seeking to help find a solution to the problem, but simply playing, I would say, to the hardest line communities, Ukrainian nationalist communities in Canada, by just attacking Russia at every turn, and rather than really trying to put support into, there is a peace process. There are Europeans who are engaged in that and really trying to support that. So a long way around to saying that this, in order to deal with this extraordinary challenge posed by President Trump, which all our allies are trying to deal with, you really need a foreign minister focused on that. Who do we work with? How do we work with them? How do we, in concrete ways, try to keep supporting multilateral rules of the road?
Justin Trudeau's had some stumbles in foreign affairs over the last 4 years, the ill-fated India trip, nothing in terms of a trade deal with China. Do you see those as having an impact on voters come October?
It's interesting. It's very, very hard to gauge the impact on voters. I mean, it's interesting. That's one of the traps, one of the problems that the Liberals faced were a number of traps that were laid, and I use those terms deliberately. I'm picking up from a foreign policy Professor Juneau, who's used this term of traps that were laid by the Conservatives, and which have made it very, very difficult in a number of areas. And partly, to sum that up, what that means is that the foreign policy, if we take Iran, for example, under the Harper government, was very much geared at assuaging that part of the Canadian community that cares about these issues, that's anti-Iran, that fled the country, and that wants a very hardline position. And that's also true with respect to the policy with Ukraine, for example. The trouble is, those are the communities that are most interested in those issues, whereas the bulk of Canadians, they're interested in good relations. I think the whole idea of Canada being back and strengthening multilateralism and strengthening the UN, that's all, generally speaking, people, the majority of people are supportive of that. But when push comes to shove, that's not the issues that they're voting on. And that's why these kinds of using foreign policy as a kind of a wedge issue to target communities that care about it, what that means is that it's hard then for the government to make changes. Because if they start to make those changes, the squeaky wheel, those that are following it most closely are going to react very, very strongly, and others, are not necessarily going to be paying much attention. So that's kind of the dilemma of foreign policy. And so it matters a lot to individual communities in particular areas, and that's why balancing everything is so important. But overall, it's harder to say what the outcome is going to be. Other than I think that broadly speaking, there is disappointment that Canada, has not, not lived up to its promise of Canada's back. But on the other hand, I think Canadians are pretty pragmatic, and I think they're also going to understand that this problem of dealing with Trump is a huge one. And that's why I think in terms of the election campaign, there's a real opportunity actually for the government to try and demonstrate that they understand, they've learned, and that they want to work harder with others to strengthen the international rules. They're going to, in order to make that credible, they're going to have to, come up with some meaningful promises. But I'm not convinced that there's nothing they can say on foreign policy that wouldn't appeal to voters.
There's a number of hot spots Canada's going to have to deal with in the near future. We'll take the U.S. out of the equation right now, but Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. Which do you see as Canada's biggest challenge?
Boy, that's the hotspot list. I would say China, and I would say that, and here again, I think the challenge, there is an opening for the Liberals, and that is because the sheer Conservatives are simply taking the hardest of hard lines. Oh, China's bad. We have to, we have to. Take a hard and principled human rights stand and never mind trade, and we have to tell them what's what. And for example, on the Huawei, on the very, very difficult Huawei 5G issue, that's it. We don't allow Huawei on the 5G on Canada's. We ban them from Canada's 5G network, and taking this very black and white stand. Of course, I mean, trade with China, it matters much more to us than it matters to China. Canada's trade with China. And if we just take the example, the difficult example of the Huawei network, I mean, banning the Huawei network means Canada loses its 5G network. I mean, it would have an extraordinarily negative impact as opposed to doing what, in fact, interestingly enough, some of the other countries that Canada works closely with, like the UK, on intelligence matters are trying to do. And that's what they're trying to do, is to ensure that they have in place the necessary protections. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that Canada is quite able of ensuring the security of its own 5G network. There's also another argument at play here, which you don't hear very much, and that is the success of Huawei, and this is why the Americans have targeted it, is that it has become it is a leading international tech company in 5G, and way, way ahead of the Americans. They're trying to take out a competitor. And what both China and Huawei have to lose by compromising that company as a global company, by using it as a backdoor, a backdoor for spying. I mean, there's no comparison. They lose far more than they gain by having this first tier company, which is ahead of the U.S. So it's interesting on the China one, but again, there you have the problem. You have the problem that, you have opposition parties, you have, the sheer Conservatives in particular saying, oh, it's black and white, they're bad. The ongoing situation with Hong Kong, people, of course, are worried about, about Chinese power. But taking a very black and white position, which would have very negative consequences for Canada, rather than a far more nuanced one, and one which recognizes that Canada actually has the capacity to ensure that that the network in Canada is not compromised. But it sort of sums up the problem. One is a very black and white approach. Although I think there's polling that indicates that Canadians understand that dealing with a country like China, isn't a black and white thing. It's more nuanced, but nonetheless, this is a huge challenge.
All right.
And it kind of sums up what some of the challenges in foreign policy that are facing, that the liberal government has grappled with. And of course, on the Huawei situation, it goes back to the United States and the fact that we were set up. I mean, the whole problem with the arrest of the chief executive and so on. I mean, we were set up by the Americans. They put us in this mess, and they're doing absolutely nothing to help us out. And, it's kind of symptomatic of the problem, but it also suggests that we really, really need, I come back to my broken record, we really need a foreign minister that's really thinking about this, looking at where we actually have room to maneuver and where we don't, and really looking at working with allies on enlarging those areas where we can work together. Because clearly, none of Canada cannot go up against the U.S. on a one-on-one. And so we really have to look closely with others. And you asked about Russia as well. I mean, again, parroting the U.S. position on Russia black and white is not helpful either. We have, ironically, even under the Harper government, the Arctic was an area where there was cooperation with Canada and Russia, and that has continued. But alarmingly, the sheer pronouncements on foreign policy seem to be taking a much more confrontational approach with respect to the Arctic, which would not be in our interest. I mean, as I said, even Harper understood that working cooperatively through the Arctic Council with Russia was in everyone's interest.
Peggy, I want to thank you for joining us.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Peggy Mason is the president of the Rideau Institute. Foreign affairs and foreign policy of the parties in the next election can be a little opaque for many to try and form an opinion. To look at platforms and how foreign affairs has impacted previous elections, I'm pleased to be joined by Stephen Saidemen, the Paterson Chair in International Affairs, as well as the Director of the Canadian Defence and Security Network at Carleton University. And Stephen, when it comes to voters, how engaged are they in their country's foreign affairs as a ballot box issue?
Well, around the world and even in Canada, foreign affairs tends to take a secondary or tertiary place. It's more of a metric not of whether somebody has the best ideas, but whether the potential leader of the party is competent enough at foreign policy. So it's not something that makes people vote for someone, but it is something that might cause people to be a little hesitant about voting for somebody, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, looking back at Canadian elections, do you recall any that were directly influenced by Canada's foreign affairs policy?
Well, I think that the last election, one of the seminal moments, one of the key moments in the campaign was the foreign policy debate. There was a specific debate organized by the Monk Group in the summer of 2015. And before that, there was a lot of, the Conservatives got a lot of hay out of calling Trudeau not ready. They said their main stance on Trudeau was that he's just not ready for leading yet. And in that foreign policy debate, he handled himself really well. He sounded very competent. And so I think he assured a lot of Canadians that he would handle foreign policy well. And that really disrupted the Conservatives' communications strategy because they bet a lot on the whole not ready thing. And then once he seemed to indicate that he was ready on foreign policy, again, one of these issues that people look at as being necessary but not sufficient for voting for somebody, Once he was able to handle the hard issues on that, it made it much harder for the Conservatives to sustain their campaign, and that was really one of the turning points.
What wins did Canada score in terms of foreign policy over the last 4 years?
Well, that's a tough question because this government came into power at a time where they thought things would be relatively straightforward, and then they got hit with the Trump election, which made everything that Canada was doing in the world much, much more difficult. And so the question is, in some ways, did Canada win or did Canada prevent losses? And I think so to just focus on big wins might be a little deceptive. But I'd say managing to get through the U.S.-Canada trade negotiations or the NAFTA trading negotiations to just modestly modify NAFTA into what is now called USMCA was a huge win given the alternatives. So I think that was a big win. Signing a trade agreement with the Europeans, which, to be fair, was negotiated mostly under the Harper government, was also a significant win. So I'd say that I'd put those two at the top. I think that generally Canada's stature in the world has been pretty high lately. People are looking at Canada as being one of the co-leaders of the rules-based international order, which is partly by the elimination process, where all the other countries that seem to be leaders of that have gone by the wayside, whether that's Britain with its Brexit or the United States with Trump. So people look to Trudeau and to Merkel as being the leaders of the liberal order, and that's important. Whether that's a big policy win or not is something else entirely.
What kind of losses have you seen in Canada deal with over the last 4 years? I had mentioned in my previous interview with Peggy Mason about the ill-fated India trip and not getting the deal with China. What other losses did you see in terms of foreign affairs for Canada over the last 4 years?
Well, I think those two are the big ones that they weren't able to move the needle much on either. It is striking that this government is much better when it works with Europe than when it works with Asia. To be fair, though, despite some difficulties along the way, Canada was able to join in on the new agreement that sort of replaces the TPP. I forget the exact initials for the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership. I forget exactly the right acronym, but so that was actually also a major win. But it probably was more costly in our relations with Japan than it should have been. That was a little more difficult than it had to be. Going back to victories, Canada leading in Latvia was also I think a big win. In terms of big losses, I'd say that they made a lot of promises about the UN, and they really haven't done much. That the Mali mission was small and short. It was important in terms of providing the capability that was desired by the UN and by some European countries. But they really stuck to their guns and tried to get out as quickly as possible, and that I think burned some bridges with some of the European countries that wanted to have the Canada stick around a little while longer. So I think the UN file was actually funny that it was supposed to be sort of the big advantage of this new government, but they've been much more of a NATO supporter than a UN supporter, which was sort of the accusation that had been made of Harper. But actually, this government has been much more pro-NATO than the previous government, but it hasn't really kept up its ambitions when it comes to NATO. When it comes to the UN, they really made a lot of promises about the United Nations, and they really haven't moved the needle much on that.
Stephen Saidemen is the Paterson Chair in International Affairs, as well as Director of the Canadian Defence and Security Network at Carleton University, joining us on the Unpublished Cafe as we talk about foreign affairs heading into the federal election. And, we've seen some platform releases from all the parties. Now, the Conservatives come out and talking about a little harsher treatment of China, reset the relationship, re-engage the U.S. Nothing concrete noted. Mainly platitudes to you, or how do you see this?
Well, this is a challenge that every party that's competing in these elections faces, which is Canada's foreign policy position in the world hasn't really changed much in terms of its overall goals and objectives. And so each party that comes to power sort of launches its own defense review and its own foreign policy platform, and it's really more or less the same thing. And so the Conservatives can accuse the Trudeau of being weak on China, but once you come into power, you realize, wow, China has a lot of leverage over Canada. And so what are you going to do exactly to push China around, given that China can overnight say, we're not going to take in, they've already stopped importing canola oil. They've already stopped importing some other things. They can go down the list. And the Canadians depend much more on selling to the Chinese market the other way around. So there's very limited leverage. So the Conservatives can promise what they want in that, but they're not going to be able to do that much when they come into power.
Considering some of the problems the Liberals have had to deal with over the last 4 years in terms of foreign affairs and foreign policy, do they change course on that platform, or do they just keep going as they have been?
I think they're going to keep going as they have been. I think they can run on the fact that their defense review was successful. It's funny because when the defense review was being discussed, there was a lot of concern that it wasn't going to be that there was a lot of concern that it wasn't going to be much. But it set forth a series of ambitions that were pretty on target, that got a lot of favor from the defense community, both those who are critical of the defense community, of the military, and was pretty favorable by the military itself. And so on the defense file, there's going to be lots of accusations about how to replace the next fighter plane. But on most of the issues on the defense file, I think that they can run on the record. On a foreign policy, they'll probably talk a whole lot more about their successes in Europe, and they'll probably try to minimize their failures in Asia. But I don't really see them shifting course in any particular kind of way.
Stephen, I want to thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Ed.
Stephen Saidemen is the Paterson Chair in International Affairs, as well as Director of the Canadian Defence and Security Network at Carleton University. Now it's time for you to weigh in with the unpublished .vote. With the exception of the U.S., which country do you feel will be the biggest foreign affairs challenge for Canada? Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, or Venezuela? You can log on and vote right now at unpublished.vote. I want to thank Peggy Mason, president of the Rideau Institute, and Stephen Saidemen. He's with Carleton University, the Paterson Chair in International Affairs. And I want to thank you for listening to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand.